Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Connor Savoy. I'm a senior fellow here at CSIS with the Project on Prosperity and Development. Thanks for joining us at the this year's Global Development Forum, and thanks for joining our panel on debt sustainability in developing countries. I'm going to just frame up this conversation a little bit, and then I'll introduce our panelists. Global indebtedness has reached unprecedented levels. Prior to the pandemic, both developing and advanced nations had already accumulated large amounts of private and sovereign debt. The IMF estimates that approximately 60% of low-income countries, or about 41 countries, are at high risk of debt distress or already in debt distress. Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic progressed, countries have furthered their indebtedness by taking on large fiscal packages to support increased health expenditures and expand social safety nets, as well as subsidies and loans to keep business and financial institutions afloat. For developing nations, this increase in debt levels raises significant concerns about the global debt sustainability and financial stability as they become unable to balance their fiscal vulnerabilities with economic recovery from COVID-19 and other development objectives such as the Sustainable Development Goals. We're also at a different moment globally for debt. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the international community confronted a similar debt crisis in developing countries that yielded the highly indebted poor countries, or HIPC initiative, that saw Paris Club creditors largely forgive significant volumes of debt that had been incurred in the 90s, 80s, and 70s. Now, though, debt is largely held by China and the private sector. China is the largest official lender to developing countries, surpassing the IMF and World Bank. This will make any restructuring or forgiveness far more difficult and will be reliant on engaging China and the private sector. The G20 Common Framework is an effort to address this changing landscape, but thus far it remains more promise than actual operationally. Today I'm joined by a great panel to discuss these issues. I have Brett Neiman, Counselor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, Doug Rediger, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Sam Custer, Director of Policy Analysis at Aid Data, and Jeff Okamoto, the former First Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. Each of them is going to make some brief remarks to start, and then we're going to move into Q&A, and we'll leave some time at the end for some questions from the audience. There's a paper on your chair. We'd ask if you could just write down any questions you might have. We'll collect them and hopefully get to as many as we can. So with that, Brent, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Connor, and thanks to the CSIS for holding this very timely, very important session. Delighted to be here. I promised I would start by talking about the other panelists, actually, who one has set the environment with which a lot of my team's work at Treasury has evolved in its thinking on this issue. Another I've personally been interacting with in recent weeks, helping evolve my thinking on this issue. And another has led a lot of the primary research and produced some of the data that's been foundational in our understanding on the issue. So very delighted to be here surrounded by them and on this panel. I had essentially a scene setter on the debt load growing, being large, and therefore being quite precarious in many dimensions. But Connor basically did all that needs to be done there. I think the need to think about multilateral restructuring processes and the potential improvement is quite obvious. I would suggest also just a different framing or an additional framing. The world is spending a lot of time talking about resilience, talking about robustness these days, eliminating vulnerabilities. And I do think that conversation appropriately is sort of centered on trade in goods, on supply chains. But I do think of this issue as in many ways quite similar. Can't make progress on some of these issues in terms of multilateral restructuring. We remove from the global toolkit what I consider to be a really important insurance or insurance-like process, which is the aid and expertise and financing that can come with, for example, an IMF program, among other things that multilateral restructuring can unlock. So I do think this is quite important and consistent with our other evaluations of resilience and robustness. This is the time to really take this on and focus as best we can. That said, as Connor mentioned, this isn't a new topic, and what has largely changed from our perspective is the complexity of the creditor and lending environment. Instruments are broader, more complex, private sector participation is greater, and the confluence of a shift from lending by Paris Club official bilateral creditors to grants, and then the increase in lending from non-Paris Club countries like China has certainly been kind of the key feature and led, as Connor mentioned, to the formation of the common framework, which has certainly, there's been no cases for the common framework that have kind of gone all the way through to the point where we would say they are successes and now we can move ahead. Our assessment is that in the common framework case and elsewhere, whether it's a lack of participation or too slow participation, China is the most important reason looking across the whole landscape for a lack of progress. And so that's one issue I know we're going to talk about today. That said, I also think this is a time when there's a real window of opportunity to make progress. In particular, the case of Zambia, which is one of the common framework cases, has made some progress, slower than we'd like, but it has made some progress. China and others have agreed to form the creditor committee. Financing assurances were provided, and now, hopefully by the end of the year, we can hammer out the financing details and go ahead move forward with that program. I view that as kind of critical, or at least potentially critical, in the sense that it very well may be possible that a lot of the problems that have stalled progress on the common framework or other similar cases for multilateral restructuring, it's just a lack of a proof of concept. It's a lack of familiarity with technical details, a lack of familiarity with process details. It is possible that making progress on this first case will actually help a lot with future cases. That's certainly our hope and something we all should be working as hard as we can toward. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Brent. Doug, over to you.
Thank you. And again, I wanted to thank all the panelists here. Everybody here has actually made major contributions to this subject area, and it's a pretty important one. So in the interest of keeping to my moderator's admonition to keep it 3 minutes or less, to give time for a broader discussion, let me just start by framing a couple of the issues, taking on where Brent left off. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that over the past, let's call it 50 years, the basic premise of global debt issuance has changed. It used to be that when a country borrowed, the assessment of its credit risk was whether it could pay it back. That is no longer the case. It is now whether it can get refinanced. Now that might sound like a subtle difference, but it's actually a big shift, because when you're talking about paying it back, well, okay, countries have to act in a way that says we're going to husband our resources to pay it back. A lot of times, and Brent made reference to HIPIC, which I was going to make reference to as well, they couldn't pay it back. But at least the premise was that they were going to pay it back. Now, we look at the Fed raising rates, we look at refinancing costs. That is the major driver, or at least a major driver, of pending debt distress, not whether they can actually, take reserves and pay back the debt that they incurred in the first place. I just think that's an important premise that we need to understand. Let me go back to HIPIC, because I think it's a good question to ask. How did we get here? And I'm not going to repeat the whole China narrative, at least not in great detail. I think it is the major elephant in the room, but it's not just the elephant in the room. I mean, it's a big elephant in an otherwise smaller room than relative to the elephant's size. That's a ham-handed way of saying the China issue is the issue, make no mistake. But how did we get here? And we got here because when HIPIC was undertaken, nobody anticipated that. HIPIC basically was an effort by the world's creditors to say, okay, we are going to wipe the slate, if not clean, somewhat cleaner, in an effort to say, let's not do this again. We, collectively, are not going to lend you the same kind of money on the same kind of terms to get you back into this situation again. And so we're going to actually create this HIPIC framework and everybody's going to be happy. If you go back to read the press clippings at the time of HIPC, it's fascinating, because actually the expectations were that we would never be in this situation again. And here we are, several decades later, and we are in this situation again, in large part because, number one, developing countries need finance. Number two, China came in and said, ooh, here's an opportunity not only to provide strategic finance, but development finance. And countries were very willing to take it for good reason. And I would argue one of the problems with demonizing China, even though as this panel unfolds, I think I will be guilty of demonizing China as much as, if not more than everybody else in this particular instance. But one of the problems is we, the collective West, have not really created an alternative source of financing. So if you are a country, before it got in debt distress, just looking to grow, you would have the private sector and you would have China. And countries often used both. One of the problems that we have today that I hope this panel gets into is the common framework, and I'm going to take issue a little bit with Brent casting Zambia as a success. I know there are a lot of people now who are basically selling it as, well, at least China came to the table. I would argue that is lowering the bar to a point where we're giving China more credit than it's due. I think that they've acted badly in the case of Zambia. I think it is a poor precedent, and I am not optimistic that Zambia is going to emerge as the precedent on which other positive, successful restructurings will take place. And I was going to say something else, and I lost myself into the Zambia story, but that's all right. But let me just say one other thing, and then I'll hand it over. I think with China being the major creditor that is not acting in what I would consider to be good faith, there are questions about what can be done. And again, this is where, Brent was saying that we should use the Zambia example as a positive take, and I'm not saying we shouldn't for strategic reasons. I just mean practically it's not a great example. But the private sector. So the private sector is sitting on the outside. The common framework by its terms does not allow the private sector a seat at the table. They are, however, expected to provide comparable treatment in whatever debt refinancing or restructuring or relief is provided. The private sector is not happy about that. But going back to Zambia, I would argue the private sector has been a model citizen because they actually created a bondholder group, a creditor committee of the private creditors almost 2 years ago. That doesn't mean that you can agree with everything that they're asking for, but the fact is they came to the table, they acted constructively, and they have been waiting for China to give the template from which they can then derive their comparable treatment outcome. What does the IMF do? Because the IMF is the central actor here. The IMF has a policy called lending into official arrears. What that basically means is if you are a country in debt distress that does not have a resolution to the IMF's debt sustainability requirements, in part because China is failing to engage constructively, the IMF could tell China, okay, we are going to provide financing to this country, and they are not going to pay you. They're going to go into arrears, and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, I'm overly simplifying, but that's basically the premise. And the IMF has been very reluctant to embrace this policy in terms of actually applying it, for good reason. Because if they do, first of all, you alienate China, but more than that, you alienate China from the country that it might actually have a very strong trade relationship with, and China might take it out on that country, which would not be healthy for the country, even though the IMF is providing financing. But having said that, the end of the 3-year period, let's say, where the fund gives its program support, you could also end up in a situation where China says, fine, we didn't agree to a debt restructuring, now pay us 100%. So it is very complicated, but I would make the case the IMF should actually roll up its sleeves and say to the Chinese government that is not cooperating on a lot of these debt issues, we're going to go into the lending into arrears policy. There's going to be a 3-year period where we're going to negotiate with you, and at the end of it, we'll deal with it. But I think that where we are right now is that China's reluctance to engage is creating an enormous logjam for a lot of countries that are now and are going to be in debt distress, and I don't think that's going to end well.
Thanks, Doug. Sam, over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Connor. Thanks to all the panelists. Great to be here this morning. So we're here to talk about options to help countries deal with navigating debt sustainability. But I think a good starting point for getting into that discussion is making sure we all have the same understanding of the problem diagnosis. And to make this concrete, I thought it would be helpful actually to look at Sri Lanka as a microcosm of a broader set of problems. And we see them navigating right now these cascading effects of debt distress and default, everything from political upheaval to mass social unrest and economic chaos. So let's look at actually why Sri Lanka unraveled. Many of the same dynamics are actually in play in countries all over the world right now, and it makes it a cautionary tale with broader relevance. So Sri Lanka's economic crisis, I like to say, is actually 3 decades in the making. It has had a chronic and steadily increasing budget deficit since the 1990s. Domestic revenues were insufficient due to tax cuts to offset ambitious public expenditures. These expenditures were often debt financed, but failed to generate the expected revenues. And this was due to overly optimistic projections of profits and artificially inflated costs due to corruption. Rather than cutting costs or raising domestic revenues to address the shortfalls, the Sri Lankan government increasingly turned to external sources of debt financing. By late 2021, that meant that Sri Lanka's external debt was upwards of 60% of its country's GDP. To quote Doug, China was not the issue, but I think it is one of the issues of this story. This creates obligations that must be repaid, and the majority of these debts were denominated in foreign currencies. And to service these debts, Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves plummeted by 2/3 in just 2 years. External shocks like COVID-19 and the Ukraine war that Connor alluded to exacerbated the vulnerability of this underlying problem of debt finance development. Foreign currency inflows from tourism and remittances declined, the prices of fuel and fertilizer imports increased, and rather than immediately turning to the International Monetary Fund to help stabilize its economy, the government instead went to China, who now is in the game of emergency lending and offers options to boost liquidity to help Sri Lanka service its debts. But the problem here is that this required taking on greater debts without addressing the root causes of the crisis in the first place. Ultimately, Sri Lanka defaulted in April, we all know this, and began negotiating with the IMF on a bailout package. But the stressors I outlined here are not unique to Sri Lanka. I recently asked and I surveyed 7,000 leaders from 141 countries around the world to identify what they saw as the most chronic blockers to development progress in their countries. And yes, they did say insufficient resources, but when you actually drill down on the real root causes there, they said it's actually not access to capital that's the real issue here. It's high levels of corruption and it's poor financial management. So either lack of resources by design or lack of resources because of negligence. So to remedy this, I think for the rest of this panel, I hope we talk about 2 important roles that IFIs have to play. Not only in terms of short-term band-aids for countries to stabilize their economies in the face of debt distress, but I hope that we talk about how IFIs are actually even better positioned to help countries remedy issues of chronic corruption and poor financial management that are not unique to debt, but it certainly exacerbates problems of debt. So that's what I hope we talk about today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with a great group of people to discuss an important issue. I think colleagues covered the scope of the challenge here, and I think Samantha's right. The way I think about this is kind of twofold, right? One is how do you put countries on a sustainable path for the debt they have, and how do you make borrowing behavior or patterns more sustainable in the future? And that gets into, I think, a lot of the things that you're talking about. And I like Doug's. I'm supposed to back cleanup, so that's why I'm kind of walking my way down the table. But I mean, I like Doug's framing of how HIPC worked, because so much of what, at least how I view the world, is you need to have a country develop and exhibit responsible borrowing and repayment behavior and investment and budgeting and the rest to climb the development ladder, right? So few countries have exhibited an ability to do this on grant assistance alone. Right. In other words, advanced economies and middle-income countries borrow to do productive investment as a way of advancing their own economies, and so developing that technical capacity, right, in a country is something that I think we haven't done enough on, frankly, and so that's why we're kind of in the spot that we're in again. I do think that we are kind of approaching the limits potentially of what IFIs are capable of doing as far as what their members have empowered them to do, right, with respect to the actual restructuring operation, right? And I think this is, we can talk about all the challenges of common framework and the rest, but fundamentally it comes down to really two things, right? The only binding IFI, piece of the IFI architecture on debt treatment is actually entering into a full-fledged upper credit tranche quality program with the IMF. And there's huge reluctance to do that, right? There's huge reluctance to do that because we've experienced 10 years of good financial conditions that have told you I may be able to muddle through and I can eke it out longer than I potentially could. But I think there's also part of the governance, the governance of the IMF is, I think somewhat rightfully, right, reluctant to impose substantial conditionality in the current environment, right, when we're dealing with many exogenous shocks that countries may or may not be responsible for. And so disaggregating those and figuring out which ones are your structural problem, and which ones are externally imposed on you, and what is a political lift that you can execute for to kind of carry out the conditions of an IMF program is hard to sort out while the world is getting more complicated. I do think that conditionality is there not because it's supposed to be tough, but because it's a primary safeguard of making sure that a loan gets repaid, right? So I think that's important. Just two other things. One is I think there's a stronger nexus today that's visible than maybe 5 or 7 years ago with advanced economies. You see this with the tightening of financial conditions, monetary policy normalization in the advanced world. So this is something that was in the backdrop, certainly made it easier on the way down, right? But we didn't think about as much, right? And now we think about it a lot more. But also the risk of recession, right, in advanced economies and the negative spillovers that creates, or the lack of tailwind that puts in place for countries that are somewhat expecting to grow out of their debt problem, right? And the last thing is with current ongoing food and price shocks, many are turning to loans to finance these, whether they're from IFIs or from other kinds of creditors. And that may not be the right thing to do. I mean, you can think about your own household expenditures. If you're borrowing to pay for recurrent expenses, this can if you let this go on for too long, can put you in a very, very difficult place. And so the world really hasn't come up with a solution on how to best address those in the short run, right? Which, in my view, probably calls for more grant assistance than what we're currently providing. So, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. And the really great remarks from this panel. I knew when we put this together, this was the right group of people to talk about that, but that really underlines it. So I want to jump right in, and I think where I want to start is, Doug, you alluded to this. When we did HIPC, it was this great example of the world coming together, but it was very clear that never again. And we were trying to set the conditions where it wouldn't happen again, yet here we are. We're facing very similar challenges. And I think this builds a little bit off of, Sam's question too about, how do we actually create the conditions in these countries to better manage, their public financial management, their own revenues and things like that. So, a broad question to this group, but how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again? What do we need to do? I think looking both from the IFI perspective, but also from the bilateral donor perspective, Jeff alluded to, looking at more use of grant assistance, but what do we need to do at the country level to ensure that as we emerge from this latest debt crisis, we don't see this again? What kind of reforms do we need to work with these countries to undertake? So, Doug, maybe go to you first, and then happy to hear from other folks.
I have no idea how to answer that question. But what I mean is, I think, history, and history doesn't mean it started with HIPC. I mean, history goes back millennia or more. Countries and individuals, and they get into debt. And at some point, debt blows up. And so, you go back to the history of Jubilee, and I'm not a debt historian, but there are people who've written about this, over the centuries, over the millennia. So I don't think there's a way to completely make sure this will never happen again. I do think that we created an institutional framework with the IMF, the Paris Club, what was then the London Club is now, some aggregation of bondholders and other commercial creditors that found a way to work together that kind of sort of worked. And again, now we have to figure out, what do you do when your largest official bilateral creditor is China, not a member of the Paris Club, and the common framework was a valiant effort. I mean, I really wanted it to succeed. And for those who are still clinging to it, I hope they're right. I just think that at some point, when your largest official creditor is not cooperating, you need to figure out either how to make them cooperate or how to create a system that works around that. And I'm not smart enough to know what that looks like, other than what I was suggesting before, to use existing rules to kind of force China to at least come to the table. And what happens thereafter, I don't know. I just would like to see them come to the table and be a constructive actor. We're probably going to have to change the name of the Paris Club, because the Chinese don't want to be a part of, something that is a Western, well, I'm just saying, so creating some new something. But let's also remember that the IMF had a valiant effort at the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, which was putting the IMF at the center, and the US and others rejected that. And so I don't know if there were an off-the-shelf or even a creative idea to get everyone to cooperate, I would be the first to buy into it. I'm just not sure I know what that looks like.
Thanks, Doug. Sam, do you want to, and to be clear, I don't mean there's an absolute way to prevent, any further debt crisis. We've had these forever, but, Sam, if you welcome your thoughts on this.
Am I on? Okay, great. So to pick up on what Doug was saying, kind of looking at this from the country perspective for a minute, I think drilling down, there's 4 constraints that solutions need to address. Lack of technocratic installation, meaning that decision-making processes around which loans to take on, what debt to take on, is frequently becoming politicized and driven by the interests of a leader. And that is actually, by the way, one of the unique challenges with Chinese financing, is that the project ideas are often sourced directly from the president or prime minister. Lack of technical capacity is another. This includes both within finance ministries, the people that are actually making decisions about debt management often are dealing with increasingly complex, sophisticated instruments that they lack the capacity to deal with. But then also within line ministries too, to do effective cost-benefit calculations on the life cycle of these projects. What are reasonable revenues to expect to offset the costs of repayment? Lack of political will and lack of government accountability are also issues. So how might you start to address that? A couple of ideas. One is focusing on building the capacity and autonomy of debt management offices within countries. And there's some ideas we can talk about later about how to do that. But I think that's where the rubber meets the road. These are the people that are signing off on new debts for the country. Increasing public financial management capacity within line ministries. There are programs that the World Bank and the IMF already actually have, but they are under-resourced, and they have generally are not paid much attention to, but they're actually pretty critical. I think that those all work when you have a willing government partner. If you don't have a willing government partner, then I think that in dealing with non-governmental actors becomes increasingly important. And so thinking about working with parliaments to push forward legislation to increase the transparency of what new debts, what new loans are taken on, that kind of increases the number of eyeballs on these things. And then lastly, thinking about building the watchdog capacity of, a data-driven media, a active civil society to kind of question public expenditures and loans.
Thanks, Sam. Jeff, do you want to make any comments on this? And then Brent, I'll let you.
Yeah, maybe just a few things. I think the technical capacity needs to be built up, right? And some of this is debt, but some of it is, I think, as you put it, in the line ministry of what is the cost-benefit analysis of what I'm going to borrow or access resources to do, which is a lot of it's financial, but also an engineering problem in some cases. It's a procurement issue. It's a project management capability, right? Some of which, the IMF and the World Bank can help with, some of which may require others. Having come from Treasury, there's an Office of Technical Assistance whose demand outstrips the ability and the resources, even after a massive plus-up over the past few years, for technical assistance on many of these fronts. And then last thing is governance, right? And just kind of the public integrity. These are free reforms from an economic perspective, right? Or, they don't cost you any money really. They cost you political capital, right? But this is something I think that can be pushed a little harder, right? Especially if the argument right now is we don't have the fiscal space or the economic space or the latitude to cut a subsidy, right? You can push some of the free reform a little harder.
Thanks, Jeff. Brent?
Thanks. A few things. So following from that framing on capacity on the side of the borrower, very much agree with those ideas. And to be sort of even more specific, I mean, on transparency, doing things like making sure that public debt is public. That's a phrase Anna Gelpern and others have used. You can imagine, laws, for example, that make it illegal to borrow without disclosing that public debt. Another source of problems can be on having no integrated, consolidated view of all the borrowing that different agents in your country or in your government have undertaken. So encouraging countries, some have already made very useful steps in that direction, to have an integrated framework, to have the capacity for a centralized authority to weigh in on any debt decisions made, for instance, by regions, other parts of the government, et cetera. And simply sharing best practices is something that we can encourage. There are conferences going on among groups of developing countries to look at, successful, unsuccessful experiences of borrowing from abroad. Making sure they get together with, procurement experts, debt management experts, OTA can be involved. Absolutely, we should do those sorts of things. And it's all complemented, I should say, by the latest wave of information, much of which provided by groups like, for instance, Aid Data, but others, just sort of showing what this type of lending has looked like. What are the terms of some of the contracts that haven't been discussed and revealed publicly before, so countries and their populations can make better decisions on that. Two other quick things. One is I don't think we should necessarily give up on some of the financial innovations, if you will, or contractual innovations that have contributed to progress in recent decades. So collective action clauses, for example, were added to bonded debt. There's a lot of work done by U.S. Treasury, partners around the world, as a way to try to facilitate and get around the coordination problem should countries find themselves in a situation where they would need to have a restructuring. And there's similar efforts, related efforts, like the effort to potentially develop sample contracts on majority voting provisions in non-bonded debt, something quite similar. There are efforts to consider state-dependent contracts like climate-resilient debt instruments. These are ideas pushed by a G7 working group that's UK-led, and I think certainly should be pursued. The last thing, just to come back to some of the comments on the common framework, I should be clear, Doug, so it's not that I think this is I don't think I would cast it as a success. I certainly want to express frustration that it took 6 months, for example, to get China's movement forward with a creditor committee. That said, given where we're at, the last answer I would give to Connor's question is we should do everything we can to try to finish the common framework cases, and I'd put even more emphasis if we can finish one. I think that does put us in a position at least of hope, where we can at least see if that tool that we, the global community, the G20 have developed can be put to use. Certainly, if so, we'd all be better off.
Thanks. So let me turn to this issue of China and its engagement in the system. How, Doug, you said they're creating this enormous logjam. So how do we break the logjam? How do we get them to the table? How do we get them to act as a responsible stakeholder, either through this Paris Club or through the common framework? I think this is the main question that all of this turns on in a lot of ways. So would love to hear folks' views on how we get China to the table. Jeff, maybe we'll start to you and we'll come back down the line that way. Jeff? I'm giving you the easy question first, right?
Thanks, Connor.
You're welcome.
I think there's been an evolution of, at least in my experience, engagement with China on this issue, right? And I think it's one that's transitioned from kind of an awareness and education of the problem to now trying to figure out how you organize the machinery to actually do this, The problem is the timelines just might not line up, right? Frankly. And I think the question as it relates to the common framework is how long of a timeline are we willing to kind of accept? Because you're trying to, you don't want to leave a country worse off in the meantime, unable to access multilateral resources. For example, in IMF program, they're actually seeking, right? If the machinery in China is still evolving. And by the way, it took some time for the, G7-ish at the time, right, to organize their own machinery to do this decades ago. So it's not, we would hope that lesson of what they had to learn many years ago is useful to accelerate the timeline in China now, but we are dealing with a very different system. But if the timelines don't line up, where do you want to go, right? Do you prioritize helping a country in a global crisis that wants to reform, right, that wants to do the right thing and take the risk? The policies are relatively inflexible to allow for that, right? I was quite active on the Ecuador, Suriname program, right? So these are both that were kind of tricky in terms of how you apply the policies of the institution and help a country that wanted to proceed on a program. Or do you prioritize the integrity of the policies, right? And the rules being the rules, and require China to come to the table before you do anything. And I think this is a difficult position for certainly the management of IFIs to be in, having been there, right? And it may not be a question that is settled by them. Ultimately, this is a question that has to be settled somewhat at a political level. And I'm not sure it's elevated to that point, frankly, right? I mean, the political channels across the world, US, China, Europe, China, US, Europe, are clogged, rightfully, with many other issues at the moment. So if that isn't going to be what breaks the logjam, maybe you have to revisit what trade-off you're willing to make.
Thanks, Jeff. Doug.
I'm going to pick up on one of the points Jeffrey just made. I think especially in the case of China, where it is all political, because a lot of the debt situation in China is managed by policy banks and different banks that all have their own governance reporting lines through different ministers and cabinet level officers and Politburo members, and it all ends up with Xi Jinping. But until it gets there, there is no coordination. So one of the great triumphs of Zambia is just to get the Chinese creditors to cooperate with one another. Now that might sound like a low bar, which is why I was offering some, criticism, but actually that's a heavy lift. But it still doesn't get you to a sustainable outcome. So I would argue if you want to really make progress, there should be a leader-level talking point. When President Biden meets with President Xi, in addition to all of the other things that Jeffrey alluded to, because there's a lot going on in the world, and you can make a case that emerging market and low-income country debt does not rise to the level of nuclear risks and Ukraine and Russia and a bunch of other very, very serious issues. But for those of us on this panel, at least, let's say we think, well, I'll speak for myself, I think it does reach that level. And I think it has to be an engagement at the level of the president, not only of the United States, but in particular in China. Because if you don't have that, then, quick aside, years ago, someone once showed me a chart of, at the time there were, I think, 26 different agencies or entities in the Chinese government, ranked from most important to least important. And of the 26, the PBOC was number 25. And but that's important because a lot of us deal with some very smart, very, let's call it user-friendly interlocutors at the PBOC. And you think, okay, I'm making progress here. But then you realize they are not decision makers. So until you get to the decision makers, or in this case, the decision maker, then I don't know if we're going to get progress on the China problem.
Thanks, Doug. Sam?
So when we're talking about how do we deal with China, I think it's helpful to separate out some myths and facts. And one of the best ways to do that is to take the term debt trap diplomacy, right? It's like any of the best myths have a silver lining of truth, and they're highly exaggerated, which is unhelpful. So debt, China is the single largest bilateral financier of development in the world. it also operates quite a bit differently than most of the traditional donors. It's also the single largest creditor in the world. But, I think what's important to say about China's debt is not so much that it is any different than what banks would do. It's just that we need to think about them as a banker, not a benefactor, not as a traditional donor. When we talk about traps, I think there are traps here. There are certainly debt traps. But the challenge with the trap analogy is it makes it sound like China intentionally wants countries to fall into a trap and stay in a trap of indebtedness, which I honestly don't buy, because that's not actually in China's interests. But there are unique features about how China sets up its assistance that are really problematic and do create perverse incentives. The sourcing of projects from leaders, the lack of transparency has been mentioned, the fact that these projects are often rushed through. They're tied to the use of Chinese firms, laborers, and suppliers without open procurement processes, and that's just rife for opportunity for these artificial cost inflations. Diplomacy. I think when we're dealing with China at the table, we have to recognize that one of the motivations for China to even engage in this in the first place is economic. It feels the Achilles heel of excess financing at home, excess capacity at home to be productive, to get a return for that. It needs to push that out. If there's a solution on the table that takes that off the table, that's not really an option for China. But there are other objectives that it has too, reputational gains. It doesn't want to be seen as a bad actor. Okay, so what do you do? One strategy might be, how do you play into what China says it already cares about? And that is anti-corruption. Xi does not like the fact that that the BRI projects are associated with high degrees of corruption. He's had a rather large, visible, and highly controversial anti-corruption reform agenda. But interestingly, I just finished a survey of African leaders and their experiences with Chinese development projects. And they said that generally, China does a lot of economic good, but one of the things that they routinely see as a problem is that their corruption has worsened in their countries. So if that's not something that countries want, that we want, or China wants, how do we actually present ourselves in cooperation as part of the solution? I think the other thing that China is extremely nervous about is this is the end result of engaged in lending in these highly risky environments. It's been out there on a ledge on its own, and as countries are increasingly defaulting and seeking restructuring, that's creating problems for itself. And so I think it actually is open to and interested in the idea of multilateralized debt instruments or the idea of pooling risk. And so how do you actually make this as an option to be a win for China? I think that there's maybe an opportunity with this whole global development initiative, this big speech that Xi gave last year, kind of promoting the fact that China wanted to be in the business of promoting equitable, transparent development that ascribes to international standards. How can Western actors and IFIs hold China to that by actually participating in, whether it's the Paris Club or whatever the next generation name of the Paris Club will be, but to say, hey, if you want to be a leader on global governance, this is where you need to sit at the table.
Thanks, Sam. Brent?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree with a lot of those helpful ideas. Engaging China, emphasizing some of the elements of their lending practices that are at odds with, in some ways, their goals, but even otherwise, some of the things that they do that directly impede successful multilateral cooperation. Things like the non-disclosures, the use of escrow accounts, some contract terms that explicitly prohibit negotiation with Paris Club, things like that. Pointing those out is one important prong. Another important thing to think about is, I think, institutional frictions, as has been alluded to in China, and just really emphasizing the extent to which those frictions themselves, again, are not in China's interests and may be part of the problem, considering ideas like having a bad bank or some independent, centralized authority that can actually make decisions dedicated around the resolution process, as opposed to having that person or that decision maker or institution pooled together with fresh lending goals and ideas and authorities might be something that could help, for example. I also think it's important to realize, and this was alluded to earlier, that sometimes countries may be aware of some of these risks, but are looking around and are starved for alternatives. So I think there's also, as part of this situation, just a real call to scale up massively, for example, MDB high-quality development finance offerings. Not only, again, is that something that I think can be justified for its own sake, but it would do service to the idea of demonstrating an alternative to some of the bad contract terms and hopefully pushing back against some of these tendencies toward corruption and some of the other issues that Samantha brought up. So those would be some issues I'd bring up.
Thanks, Brent. And I want to turn to the audience in just a minute, but I want to flip this a little bit onto the IFIs for a moment and taking a little bit off of Brent's last point. What do the IFIs need to do differently in this sort of different landscape that we're facing, and where, and in particular in a world where China is the largest bilateral official donor at this, or official creditor at this point? What do the IFIs? How do we need to think differently about the IFIs, and what, as shareholders, how do we need to approach this issue within the IFIs themselves? Sam, maybe I'll go to you first, and then go to the others.
It's a good question. I think, interestingly, when we do surveys that look at perceptions across over 100 different international donors, multilateral organizations, IFIs like the IMF and the World Bank, are routinely actually seen as some of the most influential, trustworthy organizations. So I think that's something in their credit. There's a demand within other countries to work with them. I think the challenge is that we may need to do for a rethink. I think countries routinely see that IFIs bring to the table higher quality development options, but they're seen as plodding and slow. Apologies to anyone that have worked for them. But, and some of that is by design, because you have extensive social environmental safeguards that, reduce negative bads from projects. But I think bucking that reputation for being slow and plodding, if you're a newly elected leader and you're like, I have to deliver quickly to taxpayers, I'm looking to China. I think, though, that going back to, I think, something that Jeff said, I think IFIs might need to change their reluctance to using conditions. And that sounds a little crazy, but again, I come back to this survey of leaders that I do, and we did this, presentation of looking at trade-offs, not just asking them, do you like conditionalities, because who likes conditionalities? But if you present them with trade-offs between a project that has things like anti-corruption reform expectations or environmental protections or not, they routinely do choose the projects that have these conditions. And I think it's about getting the conditions right to align with what reformers say they want to do anyway, and really drilling down on those. So I would say be a little bit less finicky and nervous about conditions.
Jeff, let me go to you now.
Yeah, don't disagree on conditionality. I mean, a big push that we were making when I was at the Treasury Department, and what I tried to continue when I was at the IMF, was more focused conditionality, right? So kind of applying the Pareto principle of which reforms, which conditions are actually absolutely critical, both as a safeguard and as a way to improve the growth outcome of the country, and not just do the rest that's ticking in time. Because frankly, sometimes you're running up against a country that doesn't have the infrastructure in place to even track all this activity. 6 pages of conditionality going on inside of a country, and making sure that these are completed on a quarterly basis, right? And I mean, it's actually kind of bureaucratically complicated. And I think, frankly, I failed, right? We didn't do this enough, and we should do that more. I don't know if that means necessarily less conditionality per se, but I think it means more focused conditionality. I think is a good thing to think about. The other thing I think is the part of the reluctance here is kind of a dilemma of, should I just muddle through and wait and let the problem get worse, potentially, hoping that it gets better, because it's so painful for me to go through the process of restructuring, because I don't know what the outcome is. I'm looking at the common framework, and if I enter in, who knows when I come out, who knows how difficult my negotiations with the private creditors may or may not be, who knows how complicated it's going to be with my bilateral creditors, right? And so one thing I just think, and part of that, I think, in a negotiating dynamic, from my perspective, is nobody really knows what the future looks like right now. the forecasts are all over the place. You can't really predict what a country can or can't pay 5 years from now, right? If they're a major commodity exporter, those prices are quite volatile, right? Especially in this environment. What happens geopolitically in their neighborhood is quite volatile. And so there's a reluctance to say, well, if the two sides take very different views of the path for the country, you'll never arrive quickly at a way to restructure the obligations. And so if that's the world we are in, right, and being a pragmatic person, then maybe the solution is not worrying so much about the super long run, right, but just trying to get a fix in place that we can agree with for now, right? What is the debt service that makes sense for you to pay over the next 1 to 2 years, not 5 to 7 years out? And what are the mechanisms and financial instruments you need to unlock the negotiation to be just a little easier, right? That still leaves open the risk that the countries end up over-indebted if you don't deal with it at the right time. But frankly, right now, the problem continues to get worse. And so I think we have to make a choice.
Thanks, Jeff. Doug?
Well, I guess I would pick up on some of the things some of the other panelists have said and say, as an alternative to Chinese financing, you've got the private sector, but you've also got the MDBs, the IFIs. But the MDBs are, in many cases, very focused on maintaining their AAA credit ratings because they finance themselves in part by going into the markets. And I think there's got to be a willingness for them to understand that if they are going to be used, and I don't mean used in a negative way, but used as an alternative source of project finance and sovereign finance as an alternative to China, that they may simply need to take more risk. And whether that is on the basis of conditions or taking on projects that are, more prone to failure at some point, I think that's probably something that we should be pushing them to do.
Thanks, Doug. Brent? And then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just certainly, as I said at the end of the previous point, scaling up MDB finance, something touched on by the other panelists, certainly would be the first response. Also, I think we would be supportive of the IMF playing a more assertive role on the process issues with respect to some of these multilateral restructurings. They obviously can't take sides once there's negotiation between creditors and debtors, but helping to push along a little more aggressively on process points, respond aggressively, make sure everyone has full transparency on any assumptions that might be problematic on debt service, on debt sustainability analyses and technical issues involved in the process. That's obviously small things, but it would be low-hanging fruit if any of those things prove impediments. It would be a shame not to do everything we can to get rid of them.
Thanks. So we have a few questions here, and I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. And I think if others have questions, we'll try to get to these. So, just to start off, we have a question on how rocky is China's own economy? What is the impact of their local loans on their overseas lending? Is there a tipping point where China has to call in overseas loans? And, I'd say I was in a conversation recently where someone characterized China's overseas finances essentially collapsing at this point, that they're reducing and they're really moving more towards a restructuring. Sam, maybe you might want to take this, and if anybody else has some thoughts, but then let's try to get to some of the other questions.
I think there's financial risks and political risks that are inherent in that question. So I think financially, there's been a lot of emphasis recently on the fact that China is experiencing an economic slowdown. To this point, when China was in the heyday of really doubling down on financing for big ticket infrastructure projects under BRI, it was dealing with a fairly healthy economic growth rate, really large foreign currency reserves. Now, I will say those foreign currency reserves, the U.S. frankly would be very jealous to have those. They're still rather quite large. So I don't think that China is an immediate, risk of collapse, nor do I think they're going to turn off the spigot of financing entirely. But I do think that because there's some political ramifications of this, that citizens at home are saying, hey, we have underdeveloped parts of our country, we have low employment levels, why are you kicking all this financing overseas, especially if countries are defaulting and not paying it back? So I think there's a certain amount of pressure there. And so I think it's an opportunity for China to do a rethink of its financing, and particularly reaching out to multilateral actors to kind of share some of that risk.
Thanks, Sam. Does anybody else want to make a comment on that or Jeff, Doug? No? Okay. We have a question, this goes a little bit to this issue around MDBs and their AAA rating, but does the G20-backed independent review of MDB's capital adequacy framework offer viable recommendations? And then, a secondary question on that one, shouldn't MDB shareholders provide general capital increases, for example, to the EBRD and the Asian Development Bank? I don't know if anyone's read this report on capital adequacy and if anybody has views on this, but we were certainly touching on this issue around AAA ratings. Jeff, do you look like you might have something you want
to? Sure, just maybe a few general observations, because I think we've been through this question, having studied it a few times just in recent years. I think there's two kind of things that box this in, right? One is the MDBs themselves are providing loans, right? So if you're dealing with a debt problem in the world, the absorptive capacity for many low-income countries, at least, to take on more loans, even if they're concessional, right, is just capped, right? So I think that's just a reality of, if you want to be paid back, how do you want to do that, right? How do you want to work that out? The second thing is there could very well be ways to scale up MDB finance. People talk about climate or kind of other lines of effort. I think this is possible, except for the IFIs themselves need to take risk, and the catalytic value financially of their ability to do that in the market is correlated to how much of the risk slice they actually take. And that risk slice needs to be weighted, right, effectively on the balance sheet. So if you take the highest risk slice, so first loss, right, which is what you get massive catalytic ability to do, you'd have to have massive capital reserves against that in the institution, and you'd probably have to charge for it, right? And so the question, right, is that when you look at the end investor rate of return, that wants to participate in the project, how many bips is he going to give up, right, to pay the MDB to take the highest risk slice off the top? And I don't think we've actually figured that math out, frankly. And there are probably ways we can experiment with discovering what that price is, but I don't think we know that enough to proceed with something at scale. I think we should explore it further, though. But I think that'd be more useful than trying to do more balance sheet innovation itself, right? I think it comes down to instruments.
Thanks, Jeff. Brent, I know Secretary Yellen had a speech last week that touched on some of these issues at a competing institution, but that's all right. Do you want to comment at all about how, sort of where Treasury is and how you're thinking about this?
I'll leave it. It is an active area where this week we have quite a lot of engagements that I don't want to get out in front of. But as you saw, the Secretary spoke on it last week, and evolving the MDBs to, better bring in private money to better handle global as opposed to idiosyncratic shocks and to scale up is certainly a real priority.
Thanks, Brent. Doug or Sam, do you have any views on this, or?
The only thing I would say to pick up on Jeff's point is, I think that is actually one of the appeals of working with China, is that they are risk tolerant. Not only in terms of their willingness to work in these countries, but the scale of the lending that we're talking about is actually, it far outstrips what the MDBs can bring to bear. I mean, the number of $500 million plus mega projects tripled the first 5 years of BRI implementation. So, I think you're dealing with a stratosphere that's very different. So I think, if you could find a way to almost pair the MDBs with China for some pooled risk that kind of brings them a little bit out of their comfort zone, but maybe reins China in a little bit, maybe some good gains from trade.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to ask one last question because we're almost at time, and we do like to try to end on time here. This is a little turning our framing on the head a little bit, but this is a question from Julie Howard, who's a senior advisor with our Global Food Security Program here. And she says, are we entering or already in a period of time when disruptions are so great and the need for finance to deal with their impact is so great that it is not practical to think of never getting into this situation again? We know that the disruptions, pandemic, climate, food, global economic shocks are already hitting the poorest countries hardest. Do we need a new approach here? Would love to hear reactions to that. It's a little bit different than how we were talking about this. Sam, do you want to go? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that thinking about this from the perspective of risk management is helpful. I don't think that we're going to absolutely 100% prevent any sort of debt crisis default in the future. That's just not feasible or viable. But I think what you can do is take the perspective of how do we help countries mitigate their risks of the frequency of that happening, reduce the severity of it when it does happen, and recover more quickly when it does. And I think that's the name of the game. So it's not avoiding it altogether, but having these systems of, I think, was it you, Brent, that talked about resilience? That's extremely relevant in the debt sustainability world as it is anywhere else.
Thanks, Sam. Doug?
I would just, I guess, focus on the private sector and say that for all of what we're talking about here, there's an enormous amount of private capital that can either be dissuaded or encouraged to be deployed, and how the international community handles the expected oncoming series of debt crises and debt restructurings is going to have a real role in whether the private sector says, you know what, in a world in which Fed funds are going to be 4 or 5%, I'm just taking my game and going home. I think a lot of us have worried that in a zero interest rate environment, a lot of what I call emerging market tourists, investors decided that, well, emerging market risk was tolerable because they were at least getting a positive return, and now they're heading to the exits. And how we treat them is probably going to influence whether they ever come back. And by they, I don't mean just the tourists. I mean those who actually are long-standing emerging market, low-income country development investors. I'm very worried that the framework that we have is at risk of finding that the private sector is the easiest group to be punished without any immediate political cost. And I think that's probably very short-sighted.
Thanks, Doug. Jeff, and then Brent, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we're facing a lot of disruptions, and as an optimist, I'd like to think that eventually we will work through these challenges. It may take some time, but we will work through them. The longer run, I think, shift that may or may not be underway, I think it's too soon to tell us, and there's a great, not to plug, but like a great Goldman Sachs chart on this, 700 years of a continual decline in the structure of global interest rates, 700 years. So if you think about, we were at the bottom, right? So the question is do you figure out a way to go lower, or are we reverting, right? And you don't even have to go back 700 years. You can go back just 50 years, right? But that tailwind provided all sorts of ability for countries to tap cheaper and cheaper money, refinance ongoing debt over and over again to kind of mask the level of indebtedness they were in. And now as interest rates revert, that all becomes more complicated. But the thing that becomes more complicated fundamentally is the cost-benefit analysis of what you want to borrow for and what you want to put in the ground. And so to me, the different approach that I think we need to take is you actually have to do a heavier reform lift, right? Others, you have to go after the non-financial, right, economic changes in your economy, to try and elevate the potential, attract more of the private money that Doug is talking about, and afford a higher rate of repayment, right? If this is the new normal that we are in, that to me, that's the biggest fundamental shift.
Thanks, Jeff. And Brent?
Yeah, so I like the talk of big, massive fundamental shifts and paradigm changes, and certainly if we can make some persistent, enormous and broad-based improvement, we should. But I also just think, if you think about, there are shocks that happen in the world. They interact with management at the borrower and lender and surveiller level, and then there's institutions that propagate those shocks and produce outcomes. I think we should keep doing what we're always doing, which is working really hard to improve each of those steps. It's true that these shocks this time around they've been very correlated, they've been large, they've been hitting us in rapid fire, but countries have made improvements in terms of the reduction of original sin in their borrowing. There's greater technical expertise and focus, reforms that have been made after the 2008 crisis on understanding feedback with banks. This is certainly not to say that we shouldn't remain extremely vigilant, but you could in principle turn the question on the head and say, a lot of forecasts would have looked at the shocks we've experienced and said, man, a lot of emerging markets would be in fact, worse shape than they are now. So again, again, it shouldn't cause us to slow down. We should keep our eye on the ball, work as hard as we can as we are. But I do think we've made some real progress and should continue notching small wins as doing so.
Thanks, Brent. Please join me in thanking this panel. I think this has been a great discussion today. Thanks to all of you. And thanks for everyone for coming out. We have a short coffee break, and then we're going to have a final 2 breakout sessions, one on food system disruptions and the Pacific Islands. And so those will start at 11:45. Thanks, everyone, again.
Be seated. Are we good? Yeah, okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here, for coming to the Global Development Forum. My name is Romina Bandura. I'm a senior fellow here at CSIS. And what a pleasure to be moderating this discussion today on, U.S. cooperation and engagement in the Pacific Islands. Before I begin, I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction of this year's theme of our conference has been Great Disruptions. In the morning, we had Minister Conroy from DFAT talk about, Australia and, Pacific Islands, so and obviously other issues, but it was very timely. We had a plenary panel on Ukraine and future reconstruction and modernization of Ukraine. And then the other three big disruptors that we're, having conversations on, debt sustainability, energy security, and, how do we ensure energy access, but also with, climate transition. So that took place earlier. And now, for those of you that are in the wrong room, we're going to talk about the Pacific Islands. But parallel to this, there's another session on food insecurity and and both the climate and Ukraine has created, big disruptions in that area as well. So I know all these issues are playing out in the Pacific Islands, so we'll dig into these development challenges. We have a very distinguished panel today. First of all, I want to thank Minister Caleb Udui for being here. He's the Minister of Finance from the Republic of Palau. It took him, he just told me it took him 30 hours. Of course, he came just for this panel, right? So welcome. It's always a pleasure to have, when we talk about development challenges in Washington, we always want to have, developing countries represented. So, but Palau is about to, graduate from development status, but thank you for being here. We also, next to me is Robert Barton. Robert is East Asia and the Pacific Office Director at the Asia Bureau of USAID. So Robert is has just returned from Philippines 3 months ago.
I was there through 2019.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. But you lived in the region, and he will talk a little bit about, the USAID has a new strategy for the Pacific Islands. So it's a 5-year strategy, 2027. And the Biden administration also has just hosted the first, not the first, but a big summit, right? 2 weeks ago. Oh, it was the first. Okay, sorry about that. Yeah. And so then we have next to the minister, James Hall. He's Minister Council of International Development at the Embassy of Australia here in the U.S., but then also Assistant Secretary of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, DFAT. Yes? Did I get it right? Okay, good. And finally, to keep us honest, is Professor Alan Tidwell. He is the professor of the practice and director of the Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown University. So welcome, Professor. Let me, pose a very broad question to all of you gentlemen, so we can kick off the discussion. But what what are some of the big challenges, development challenges, and maybe security challenges that this region is experimenting right now and in the future? So maybe I'll start with the minister, and then I'll turn it to the other panelists. So, the minister, the floor is yours. Just press the.
Okay, technology. Thank you, Romina, and thank you, everyone, fellow panelists, and those of you in the audience, both here and virtually. Very nice to be in Washington again and to be able to speak in front of all of you, share some of our experiences. I think this panel is a very interesting one when we're talking about disruptions. I think in the Pacific, in particular in the more recent history, in the facing climate change, this is the appropriate word, disruptions. Volatility is something that we're looking more forward to experiencing than in the past. And I think disruptions to our economy, to our society, to our health, to our livelihood, must be met with equal disruptions to try to balance the volatility that we are experiencing. And not to say that we're more special than anyone else, but it is particularly challenging for us. And there is evidence, scientific data that shows that the Pacific small island states, developing states, are more vulnerable and face larger challenges than the rest of the SIDS as a category and other LDCs. So it's important that we can come here and share some of this thinking, some of the perspectives to help you understand some of the challenges that we face and how they are not quite straightforward, that they are multifaceted, and it takes innovation and assistance from a lot of our good partners, many of which are in the United States, many of whom I hope to meet while I'm here. But having these discussions is so important to finding a way forward. And if anybody has any suggestions, we're happy to take them as well. Yeah.
Okay, Minister.
Thank you, Romina. Thank you, Minister, and other panelists. Appreciate the warm welcome and look forward to a fulsome discussion this morning. I'm pleased to be with you all here today to discuss some of USAID's cooperation and engagement in the Pacific, and we're pleased to be a strong partner with our counterparts from Palau on the work that we're doing with them. As many of you know, and as Romina mentioned, the U.S. hosted the first United States Pacific Islands Summit a couple of weeks ago here in Washington. This was an opportunity to highlight the goals and values that the U.S. and Pacific Islands share. At the summit, the U.S. announced the first ever national strategy for the Pacific, which aligns with the Pacific Islands Forum 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent, as well as a number of other initiatives, including the expansion of USAID's presence in the region, and I'll touch on that briefly. It's an exciting time as the U.S. renews focus on deepening our partnerships with our Pacific Island partners so they can work to achieve their development goals, particularly in the face of some of today's most pressing challenges, including climate change. Before I returned to Washington, as we mentioned, I had the opportunity to serve at our mission in Manila, Philippines for 4 years, and right now USAID's programming for the 12 Pacific Island countries that we implement development assistance in is currently based out of Manila. So during my time there, I was able to get out to a few of the Pacific Island countries, including Fiji, Marshall Islands, Micronesia. Unfortunately, I didn't get to Palau, but hope to one of these days. And I was able to see firsthand, some of the challenges that the Pacific Island nations are facing, including threats to biodiversity and communities resulting from climate change. Over the years, we've partnered with local organizations throughout the Pacific and the governments on issues from climate adaptation to disaster preparedness, promoting inclusive democracy and good governance, strengthening health and education, and protecting ecosystems that are a source of livelihoods for many of the Pacific Islanders. This year, as Romina mentioned, we did release a new 5-year strategic framework for the Pacific, and this will guide our work over the next 3 years to promote a free and open, connected, prosperous, resilient, and secure Indo-Pacific region. It links into the broader Indo-Pacific strategy. It will help to build more resilient communities that can respond and adapt to the challenges of climate change and the disasters, many of which they face on a regular basis, pandemics and the economic shocks that, like we saw with COVID. As an example of some of the work and progress that we're doing in the region, we're working to support 3 digital infrastructure projects that will benefit Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, and Palau, connecting them to faster, secure, and more reliable communication so they can share information and access early warning systems. This connectivity also makes it possible for more agile, sustainable economic growth. And working with our partners, the Australians and Japanese, with the in Palau, working to put in place an undersea cable that will help Palau with faster, more secure internet. Also, partnering with Australia, Japan, and New Zealand, we're working under the Papua New Guinea Electrification Project, or PEP, we call it, which was launched in 2020. And this is an effort to help increase the number of Papua New Guineans who have access to electricity. So right now, we've increased that by about 30%. Papua New Guinea is vastly rural, and so access to electricity really helps improve the daily lives of the folks. USAID is also bringing the private sector in with other donors so that we can work with Pacific Island countries to access climate finance, which is a big issue that comes up in a lot of our discussions with our Pacific Island partners. This can help bolster livelihoods and communities' ability to mitigate climate change and adapt to the challenges that they face as a result of the climate change. Through a regional project that we have called Climate Ready, we've helped the Pacific Island countries access more than $440 million in climate finance through a number of financing institutions. And then also, as I touched on, we're expanding our presence in the region. So right now, USAID has staff in 6 of the 12 countries in which we program. We have staff in Fiji, in Papua New Guinea, in Solomon Islands, Palau, Micronesia, and Marshall Islands, and we'll look to expand that over the course of the coming years. We'll look to also continue to work with our Pacific partners to advocate for their needs and to support the priorities that they put forward, and to partner with other institutions within the U.S., including NOAA, to help strengthen early warning systems so that communities can best prepare for future disasters. And we'll work with the island countries to address illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, and also partner with civil society organizations to advocate for rights and freedoms for all Pacific Islanders and indigenous groups. Again, our work aligns with the 2050 Blue Pacific Strategy to foster prosperity and resilience, strengthen the regional connections, and promote inclusive governance, and bolster the U.S. Pacific ties and linkages for years to come. Again, we're excited about the future work that we have in the region and our partnerships, and I look forward to having a broader discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And I'm sure you won't, have trouble recruiting people to go to Fiji or other places. So let me now turn to James, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this panel, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I might start a little bit with a bit of an overview of how we work in the Pacific, because I think we've heard very well from the Minister around the priorities. I'd also draw your attention to the speech from the Minister for International Development in the Pacific, who spoke at the keynote this morning. I think there's a lot of good content there that this really responds to. So we start from the first principle that Australia has a profound sense of kinship with the Pacific, drawing on our long-standing bonds that have been forged in times of crisis, but also in times of peace and prosperity. There was a 2017 Pacific Step Up that reflected a change in the way Australia engaged with the region, really building on that sense of shared history. And we're now deepening and broadening our Pacific partnerships and engagement across our sectors. Our Foreign Minister has recently said that we understand we need to work shoulder to shoulder together in face of these three big crises the region faces: COVID-19, climate change and increasing strategic contest. The Australian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister have also emphasised that Pacific priorities will be at the forefront of how our government engages, and have repeatedly underscored a commitment to listening to Pacific voices. That our Foreign Minister's first bilateral trips were all into the region is absolutely illustrative. She took over 6 bilateral visits to the Pacific in the first few months in the role: Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Solomon Islands, New Zealand, PNG, and if I have my timing right, I think she's actually in Tuvalu today. The Prime Minister, Foreign Minister and Minister for International Development in the Pacific all also attended the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Week. So really strong commitment for prioritising those relationships from the new government. In the inaugural speech to the Pacific Island Forum in May, the Foreign Minister recognised climate change as an existential threat to Pacific Island countries, reaffirming the 2018 Boe Declaration, which identifies climate change as a key national security threat for the region. The Australian Government is also deeply committed to climate action at home and has established Australia as a climate leader internationally, including legislating a new 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 43% below 2005 levels, putting us on track for net zero by 2050. As part of that broader commitment, we're establishing a new Pacific Climate Infrastructure Financing Partnership to support climate-related infrastructure and energy in Pacific countries and Timor. And quite clearly, we recognise the devastating impact that COVID has had on the Pacific through health outcomes, but also the economic challenges that COVID has presented to the region. So we're going to have a key focus on supporting economic sectors over the next few years. A 500-odd million increase in development assistance over the next 4 years will contribute to this. Other priorities for our development program: mitigating the effects of climate change, strong focus on promoting gender equality and social inclusion, and also increasingly strengthening the role of First Nations people in our development program. Alongside that, we're looking to expand opportunities for Pacific workers and families in Australia, while also improving their working conditions and creating pathways for permanent residency through a new Pacific engagement visa. We're seeking to strengthen Australia's role as a reliable security partner in the Pacific. The security of the Pacific is a shared responsibility of the Pacific family. And we'll enhance these partnerships through expanded maritime security program focusing on IUU fishing and establishing an Australian Pacific Defence School to provide training programs for Pacific Defence and Security Forces. Strengthening the already deep people-to-people links with the Pacific is also a very high priority for Australia. We're working in areas such as boosting broadcasting and enhancing training for journalists, regular bipartisan parliamentary visits to the region to strengthen partnerships with Pacific leaders, emphasising our cultural, sporting and family ties, including really celebrating Pacific communities in Australia and their contribution to Australia. And as I mentioned before, an initiative to develop ways to put First Nations voices and perspectives and skills at the centre of our engagement with Pacific Island countries. And then finally, our view is that a strong, united Pacific Islands Forum is central to protecting our shared interests in a peaceful, prosperous and resilient region. We are stronger when we are together. We support the Suva Agreement as a way forward and will continue to work together to engage all members of the Pacific family. A unified PIF is critical to meeting the challenges facing the region that I've outlined. So as you can see, we're engaging deeply and holistically with the Pacific across a number of areas, but at its heart, listening and responding to Pacific priorities is the heart of our approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the minister this morning highlighted listening and working as in partnership with the countries. So, Professor Tidwell, how do you see the challenges in the region, both development and security? I know you specialize on security issues, so please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. It's interesting to listen to my colleagues here. You all are representatives of government, and so I get to be the voice of other. And so thank you very much for the opportunity. I just want to back up, if I could, for a moment and just underscore some of the development challenges of the Pacific. I think there are four key challenges in the Pacific, and one is really a challenge of geography, and it's the tyranny of distance. You know, the Pacific is a long way away from many of the metropolitan regions. The minister today traveled 30 hours, and that's a long trip. When I talk to people in my role as the director of the Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies, I always get the question of, you know, how do you stand that trip? It's so long. It's far away, but also the Pacific Islands themselves are far away from themselves in many instances. You think about the distance in the Federated States of Micronesia between Corsay on one side and Yap on the other, and it's 2,000 miles, right? And so it's a long way away, and so economies of scale are difficult to muster in that context. And it's an important point to keep in mind as we sit in Washington, D.C. and complain about rush hour traffic, to remember that the peoples of the Pacific have challenges that are very much unlike what one would experience here on the continental United States or continental Australia. The second challenge, I think, and this is one that I think really needs to be underscored dramatically, and is climate change. The Pacific is constantly reminding the metropolitan countries of the importance of climate change. And to be very frank, I think the perception is often that in the Pacific that they kind of get yeah, okay, it's climate change, and then move on. Their issue is not just adaptation. Their issue is mitigation. It's the reduction of the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And right now, today, you would have to say that the world has failed miserably at that challenge. And so Dame Meg Taylor, the former Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, just wrote just the other day about the failure of the West, the failure of the industrialized world to address climate change in a serious and meaningful way. So I appreciate that we have two development professionals here in the room, and they're not responsible for the mitigation issue. They're responsible for adaptation projects and adaptation money. But the Pacific is crying out for not merely adaptation, but addressing mitigation. And I think that that will continue to be a difficult political issue until we actually get some progress on it. And of course, part of that story is also, you know, that the world should care about the people of the Pacific. The minister's President Whips, has said, care about us not because of some strategic interest, care about us because of who we are. We are your fellow human beings. And I think that it's a profound message and an important message. And it gets played out in the context of climate change and geostrategic interest. You'd have to acknowledge that the United States only increased its interest in the Pacific Islands region as a consequence of geostrategic competition. But the Pacific doesn't want to have the world interested in it because it's a speed bump in the contest between Beijing and Washington. People of the Pacific want to be cared about and have people be interested in them for themselves. But geostrategic competition can sometimes actually just leave out the interests of those Pacific peoples. But as a consequence of that geostrategic interest, Washington and other capitals have doubled down on their interests now. They're beginning to expand their interest in the Pacific. We're seeing the Pacific Islands policy announced by the Biden administration. We're seeing the Pacific Summit. These are wonderful events. They're monumental steps forward. But we have issues that we still need to address, not least of which is concluding the compacts of free association negotiations. And without resolving those compacts, American engagement in the Pacific is at risk. It is a fundamental step that must be taken in order to engage in the rest of the policy with the Pacific. But that geostrategic competition also has another challenge. As Dame Meg Taylor in her piece the other day, she said, you know, China is a development partner of the Pacific Islands. China delivers development results for the Pacific Island peoples. And we shouldn't look at them as a second rank or a second tier development partner. And I think it's important to keep that in mind because, of course, the Chinese are one of the major providers of infrastructure development in the Pacific. Western countries, by and large, have got out of the infrastructure business, and so it's often left to other parties. If you look at who's rebuilding the airports and upgrading the airports in Solomon Islands, it's not Western construction companies, it's Chinese construction companies using ADB and World Bank money to improve those airports. And so it's just a reality that the Chinese are a Pacific development partner, and one has to just deal with it. The geostrategic competition, though, leads to a problem here in Washington. And that problem is Pacific expertise. It's institutional depth. Robert Barton mentioned IUU fishing, and Robert, thank you for mentioning that. It's a wonderful opportunity for a segue. So you think about the Marine Safety Act, which actually lays out some of the groundwork for the problem of IUU fishing, that, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And the interagency working group that is responsible for IUU fishing is identified in the legislation of having 45 agencies and bureaus who have some interest or responsibility for combating IUU fishing. That is a bureaucratic nightmare, right? I mean, that's a difficult task to manage. And so one of the challenges that Washington has is having the full-time equivalent employment status for bureaucrats in Washington with Pacific expertise who have responsibility for the Pacific. Secondly, it's developing the institutional patterns and habits of work that encourage people to look at the Pacific and to consider career paths in the Pacific, because today there are not career paths in the Pacific. And so Washington has a bureaucratic issue, an institutional problem that will take several years to actually resolve as we begin to advertise and fill those positions. And so we look across the table at USAID, and AID has got some of the deeper benches on the Pacific. And it's wonderful to see that the Pacific office is effectively moving from Manila to Fiji. But once again, Fiji is still far away from an awful lot of the rest of the Pacific. It's a big distance, it's a big space. It's a good move, it's an important move, but it doesn't solve all the problems. So I've laid out 4 different areas, I think, that are important to keep in mind. And I think I'll turn it back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And it's true about, deep knowledge on the Pacific, because we also, when we put together this panel, it was a little bit of a challenge to say, okay, who are the experts on these issues? So I really I thank you for raising that point. And now I would like to talk a little bit about the connectivity challenge and COVID, and how I know. Minister, you mentioned, and James, you mentioned the COVID has been a very, very big disruptor, but also it's been also an opportunity for digital transformation. And connectivity. Can you a little bit elaborate on, the COVID challenge? How is your country, emerging, let's say, from, the COVID pandemic? And I know a lot of other countries took, this opportunity to improve and upgrade, their digital infrastructure and their connectivity. So, if you can elaborate on that. And I'll start with you, Minister, and then, turn it to you, Robert, because I know USAID is a big player in this field.
Thank you. First, we are installing a second cable, submarine fiber optic cable to Palau. So we already have one, and we can see a dramatic change in our opportunities that we have before us because of it. COVID was disastrous to us. We basically lost our economy. Tourism-based economy doesn't work if you don't have any tourists. And while other parts of the Pacific, other parts of the world have recovered 80% or even over 100%, we have not. So
where's the source? What's the main source? Where do they come? Where are the tourists from?
our tourists are primarily from Asia, and that's part of the challenge that we have. Is most of the Asian countries that provide our tourism market are still closed. One of the challenges that we have with them is it's not so much us, Palau, being open to accept tourists, but that once they go back home, they're locked down for 3 days or up to a week. They're not allowed to use public transportation, so they're just not incentivized to travel. And if they were, they'd have to pay a lot larger amount to travel to our countries to visit, and that's not something that they're willing to do. So it is a challenge. If I can get back to COVID, COVID for us, wiped out over 30% of our economy, and we don't see growth coming back anytime soon. The recovery from the damage to our economy will take at least 10 years for us to get back there. All the while, we're not doing what we need to do to develop our economy and our people. So it's been a challenge, but we do have some good friends. Palau had, I like to say, over 100% vaccination rate with the help of the United States and our partners with PPEs. We were eligible for the CARES Act and Rescue America plan, so a lot of our people were helped with that assistance. We didn't have any jobs, businesses, and employment. But that money is kind of drying up.
And you took debt, right?
We took debt to cover the other parts that weren't assisted through the American assistance. So we've put ourselves into a hole. And as I said, tourism's not coming back. So I'm planning on borrowing again just to keep us working as a country. That doesn't mean that I'll have much money to handle other things. One of the types of loans that we received from the Asian Development Bank, which has been a big help to us, that was a policy-based loan. So we've had to undertake several reforms as part of this. I have my director in the audience here today. Come January, he's expected to implement these reforms without a hitch. Like I said, tourism hasn't come back. This reform in tax puts the burden of taxation on the tourism sector. So without any tourists, I'm hit with a double whammy. Implementation of a tax regime focused on tourists without any tourists to collect taxes from. So this is partly why I need to get the additional funding to support this potential gap in fiscal resources. It took us 20 years to get the tax reform implemented. And if we lose the opportunity, it may take, hopefully, not more than another 20 years or longer. And borrowing is something that's very new to us. It's funny when they say OECD says we've graduated when we don't feel like it. When we go to the markets and can't get money at the rates that they're expecting us to, they say we're a higher income classified country, but all of that income is wiped out by increased costs because of COVID, because of the Ukraine aggression. So people are earning less. Mm-hmm. So we don't feel like we've graduated. So it's been a challenge. With COVID, many of our neighbors in the North Pacific received grants. We had to borrow. With the fiber optic cable, many of our neighbors received grants. We had to borrow. So Palau has been put deeper in the hole because we have succeeded and graduated in our income per capita. So we are, trying to explain to people, you need to look at us differently. And the MVI is one way to really capture that issue of how to classify us, because we are not, we don't fit in the boxes very, very easily. So we're hoping that will be something that's adopted sooner, especially by our partners, and I think it'll make a difference in helping us, like people say. The other perception is, there is value in the Pacific to the world. The ocean and its resources as carbon sink is something I think that's very valuable that people are not taking into consideration. And then, of course, the value to it strategically. Palau is referred to as the tip of the spear when it comes to strategic importance, especially for the United States. So I think those values need to also be captured when Palau is being assessed in terms of its development and considered in terms of what assistance Palau should receive. Our president is very fond of speaking publicly, and one of the things he says is, our small population is challenging for us when you're expecting us to protect the very important border in the Pacific, the northwest border to the South China Sea. So I think those considerations should be looked at when reviewing Palau and its needs, and how those needs relate to everybody else's needs that reflected in our partnership. So thank you, just sharing some of those thoughts.
Thank you. And you mentioned, 30% of your economy was wiped out. Are there any, other sectors that could be developed, to diversify the economy? I'm thinking, we spoke about, fisheries and others, but what are some other, options for Palau and for, in the Pacific Islands? So maybe, I don't know, I'll turn to Robert and, please, you start and then I'll turn to Robert and the other panelists.
Thank you. Professor mentioned distance. And I've heard technology, communications as the death of distance. And I think that really does, holds true in our case at least. But it also offers us a lot of opportunity. We have a very fast internet speed. You're all welcome to come to Palau and try it out for yourself. Make sure that I'm telling you the truth. But there are opportunities to address some of the other challenges that we have. We have some financial sector challenges that we have involving correspondent banking and payment systems. We are a small country. We don't have very developed laws that support payment systems. It's something I've been working on very hard to address. So utilizing the digital opportunities that we have before us. I'm referring to a specific program that we're undertaking for stablecoin. I think this will provide a very simple and cheap way to improve financial access and inclusion in our country. So you can imagine, Palau is fortunate. We have all different land types in Palau representing the whole Pacific. So we're kind of representative of the whole Pacific. So we have atolls, we have coral islands. A lot of these islands are remote. We're trying to develop them for their communities. It's very difficult to ask someone to get on a boat, spend $6 a gallon to drive to the main island to go visit my director and pay his taxes. Hard to run a business when you have those kind of expenses and you have to be away from your business that you're trying to run. So digital opportunities, I think, will really help us out. And again, perspective really matters. This is something that we think will really improve our economic position, at least a point in our economic position. So one of the reasons why I'm here in Washington is to talk to people, to explain to them what we're trying to do, why we're trying to do it, and how we're trying to address the potential risk, which we do understand. But we are using the US dollar in our market, and we understand that we have to protect the reserve system and the dollar. But at the same time, we do need to think about our people and how we can give more of them access to banks and to banking services, as we can't have Venmo and PayPal in our country. It would be more difficult and costly to do that than to try to adopt a stablecoin.
So let me ask James and Robert, is digital, digitalization an opportunity for USAID and for, DFAT to maybe work closer together? I don't know, I'm just throwing it out there, but yeah.
I'm happy to start on that one. So these challenges of connectivity are really front and central for the region, and we've talked about telecommunications, but also access to energy and transport writ large. And the period of the pandemic has been particularly challenging for connectivity. Transport has been there's been the need to address COVID rules, but there's also just been the economics of running regional airlines, of ensuring connectivity. So we've been working with the US, with the World Food Programme, through a Pacific Island Forum-led program. It was initially called the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway, but it's evolved over time to really be a supported network of flights which have helped people and goods move through the region. So that's one example of how we can all work together. Digital connectivity has been a key theme for us. We have a partnership with the US and Japan, the Trilateral Infrastructure Partnership, which is amongst other things, quite focused on digital connectivity. In fact, its first and flagship program was the support to the second Palau cable. And that in itself has an interesting story because it was really going forward largely on a commercial basis ahead of COVID. And the cost of doing so really became prohibitive, facing the revenue constraints that Palau was facing. So the three donors got together and restructured that program with the government of Palau to work out how to provide that service in an affordable way. It's a nice example. It's a good program. It ties into some broader region-wide digital connectivity work that's underway, and I think it is increasingly becoming a model for how we want to work on digital and connectivity issues in the region. Thanks.
Well, I think I'd just echo what James said. I think it's an area where there is ongoing partnership between the U.S., the Australians, the Japanese, and then also in some other areas with our New Zealand partners as well. We look at the electrification in Papua New Guinea, which also would have an impact on connectivity. So in addition to the Palau spur cable, we're also working on a East Micronesia cable, which would connect some of the other countries to the east. To the point of the minister, I think first getting that foundation down and having the connectivity is key, and then looking at some of the opportunities that would be available following that. Could be some discussions going forward, and then just on COVID, we understand that it did have a devastating impact. I think overall, throughout the 12 Pacific Island countries where USAID programs, we programmed about $57 million in assistance over the course of the primary period of the pandemic, a mix of supporting vaccines through COVAX and with USAID funding directly, and then working with communities there. But the follow-up is important. As you said, it's had a significant impact on the economies. USAID has a small grants program. It's called the Pacific America Fund, where we do work with, we put out solicitations on a cycle where local organizations, and it is really focusing on working with local organizations, can respond with proposals for interventions that they feel would be most appropriate for their communities. And so we see that as a way to help assist with the recovery. Obviously, in a country like Palau that's suffered 30% of its economy being impacted, particularly in the tourist sector, that's huge. And so we're trying to work, at a local level, and hopefully, as we continue to move forward, we'll see the recovery and the tourists come back. So.
And I know, Professor, you mentioned, it's going to take, a while for, Washington to get, deep knowledge on the region. But, what are some, areas where United States can, rely on our, other partners and, cooperate? Where are some of those opportunities? Because obviously, the amount of funding that China is putting in the region, it obviously is very large compared to other donors. So how can Australia is of course as well, but how can United States work with Australia? What are some of those areas of cooperation that you see in the future? And that question is also. If all the panelists can maybe, talk about it from their perspectives. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. I think there are a lot of places in which the United States can cooperate with regional partners, and certainly the partners of the Blue Pacific is a sort of a foretelling of that. So the partnership, was announced several weeks ago. It was originally the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and and the UK, with France watching. And they keep saying that France is watching, so I just want to throw that in there, that France is there, but not a formal member of the partnership. But we've added Canada, we've added Germany. The really interesting question is what does that cooperation look like? So, is that an effort in deconfliction? Is that an effort in coordination, or is it an effort in cooperation? And by cooperation, we would see projects not unlike the electrification program in Papua New Guinea, which is a collaboration between Australia, the United States, Japan, and rolling that out. And I'm sure that there are other opportunities that one could look at, like IUU fishing. And we already see collaboration and cooperation in IUU fishing, and there's more space to develop there. The Australians have the Pacific boat program run out of the Department of Defense, which has been a great asset to the Pacific Island countries. And so patrol boats are donated to Pacific Island countries for monitoring their EEZs. And the Japanese have done a similar sort of thing at a smaller scale, smaller vessels. The United States sort of gets into that space with the Coast Guard, but there's no reason why the Australians, evolving border force, and others couldn't collaborate and cooperate in the Coast Guard kind of operations. The really interesting piece of that story, though, really has to do with being sure that you have instrumentalities that are fit for purpose. So while the Coast Guard has deployed to the Pacific, and that's a great thing, the Coast Guard is stretched, and the Coast Guard's vessels are not really suited to the kinds of missions they're being deployed upon. Coast Guard cutter, I think, goes to sea for, 14 days, and they're asked to do 45-day-long missions. And so this is quite a big challenge. And having vessels that are more suitable to that kind of service would be an important step. For instance, a place where Australia and the United States could collaborate, and this is just kind of thinking off the top of my head, is Austal, which is an Australian boat manufacturer, which also has a facility in Alabama. There's no reason why you couldn't actually create a couple of vessels that are fit for purpose for doing Coast Guard-like activities in the Pacific. Thanks.
Minister, what is your view? How can you work with different governments and donors? So what is your view on cooperation?
Yeah, I think cooperation is useful. I remember a meeting many years ago when the multilaterals got together and said, well, ADB, you're kind of the closest one next to Palau in Manila, 2 hours away. Why don't you take the lead? And I thought that's worked out very well. They're very active in Palau, and I think we've shown ourselves to be a good client for them. I think the cooperation should be organized in a similar way where we do have presence. When I hear of offices that are set up, it's usually in Fiji. Fiji might as well come to Washington. It's far away. We have to go through Honolulu just to get to Fiji. It's very far away from where we are. And they often have a different perspective on the rest of the islands from down there in Fiji. So I think presence is something that's very useful. It also helps us get over this problem of having to re-educate people whenever they come into town, and educate all the partners so we can have one resource that we share information through. I think that will be a little bit more useful in our sense. One of the Asian Development Bank's strategies has been to open up country offices, and I think that's worked out very well. At the annual meeting this year, the islands were asking if we can empower those offices a little bit more. And I think that would be useful. USAID, I've been speaking to the lady that's in the embassy down there, and I think there's a plan to be a little bit more active, but it's an example of the challenge that we have while the U.S. agencies like Rural Development, USDA, USAID, they're all locked up in the embassy. So figuratively speaking, it's not available to us. So we understand the challenges, but when we have better presence and better communication, I think we are able to come up with a lot more when it comes to cooperation and assistance in initiatives, especially when they benefit both parties.
So last, James and Robert, can you address this issue? And then I want to open up the floor for some Q&A from the, if people have questions, we're going to have mics.
Thank you. I'm happy to go next. So this issue of coordination, I think, is a really important one, and we're very encouraged by the formation of the partners in the Blue Pacific. As was outlined, it's a new initiative. It's coming together. It's very much an informal coordination mechanism, but I think one of the things that's very powerful about it is that it is aligned with the Blue Pacific 2050 strategy. So it's taking its lead from the priorities that the region is setting for itself. That in itself gives you the basis for good coordination. So you know that the resources of donors are being aligned with the priorities and the resources of the countries. And there are a number of streams of work there around climate change, resilient technology and connectivity, protecting oceans and environment, people-centred development, resources, and political leadership and resilience. So I'd commend that strategy as the basis for work in the region. I did want to pick up on a point that the Minister made earlier around the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index, which is a fairly technical piece of work that's going on in the UN system, but it goes to actually a much more important issue, which is that our traditional means of measuring income levels in the Pacific are not effective. So it's not a matter of GNI or GDP per capita. Those are useful for some elements, but they are not fully reflective of the costs and the challenges of doing business in small, isolated markets. So we do need to find a more sophisticated way of recognising risk, of recognising vulnerability, and of allocating resources against that risk and vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. You have the final words. Yep.
Sure. Well, thanks, James, for touching on partners in the Blue Pacific. Yeah, I agree 100% with what you had to say on that, and just to emphasize that, I think the partners would see this as an opportunity for us to work together in direct support of the goals and objectives within the 2050 strategy, and not something where the partners are operating outside of that. And so it can help us, I think, determine who, comparative advantages and who's best suited to support various aspects of that. So I think it can be a productive framework going forward. To the minister's point, as a Foreign Service officer, I'd like to say we don't like being holed up behind the embassy walls, and so I'll certainly convey that. And I'm sure our folks on the ground there would love to get out and not just meet with you and your government counterparts, but get out and really spend time with the folks in Palau, because that's really where our bread and butter is. It's there, not standing behind the walls, doing paperwork. Though unfortunately, that's what we end up doing a lot of the time. And then I think just on the IUU point, I would agree with the professor. There are a lot of players involved in that. I think USAID has recognized, a certain aspect of that is security related, and that's not our purview. So we tend to work more at the community level with local organizations. And in some countries, we do work with local law enforcement, but it's putting in place policies that are enacted at a local level within that. So having communities that rely on the fisheries and the resources there as their livelihood and for food security, recognize the importance of needing to manage that responsibly. And so I think there are various layers within the IUU spectrum, and so that's kind of where I think we fit in best and try to focus on that.
So we have some minutes left, and we have a very, an audience here. So I don't know if anybody has any questions. And the lady here and the gentleman here, and we have mics. Please, can you identify say your name and your affiliation?
Thank you very much. My name is Sharon Inone. I am from the Solomon Islands. It's a privilege and honor to be here. I'm sure I'm the smallest fish in the room today. I come from a rural, remote Solomon Islands, an island that is sinking, and climate change is an emotional topic for me. Like, I come here, I cannot go back to my people with the Pacific Partnership Strategy, they will not understand that. What they will understand is tangible developments happening. And when we talk about climate adaptation, we ignore the existing conditions. My people from the rural communities cannot adapt if we do not solve existing conditions. I left my small island and I come here because of a professional fellows program, US and the Pacific, and I'm selected for my country. And I left my people because I was promised a follow-on project. And my project is on Wi-Fi. Thank you very much for the information you've provided on your commitments to the Pacific in terms of digital connectivity. And I want to share my story that it was revealed when we were in Hawaii for the orientation that the follow-on project is only 1,000 USD. I told them that that is not enough, that is only enough to host a village feast. Why am I sharing this story? I want to go back to my people with something that will change lives. When we talk about the partnerships, how do we ensure that we build the capacity, not, you were speaking about full-time expertise that are based in Washington, but we also need like Pacific experts. We need to develop Pacific experts as well. So when we make decisions up here, we also communicate with the rural populations, so we understand their needs and we solve them. And when we choose to come on this type of programs as a young person, I'm exposed to the geopolitics. Like now I'm seen as someone that is a US advocate. I cannot go back to China and so I'll tell them, can you fund my project? Why am I sharing this? Because I want to go back with something. And today I know that there are people in this room. If you want to put, whatever we are talking about to action, then I'm appealing to people that are here. Robert, I know you have
a tangible project.
Yes, a tangible project. I have a 15,000 USD that I can go back and advocate to my people and say, this is what US is talking about. They are serious about their partnership with the Pacific. When we talk about sustainable development goals, we have the 16th.
We have to, I'll ask another question and then we'll come back to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm just here to share that. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another question here from the gentleman.
Thank you. I hear the emotion in this young woman's voice, and I think we all feel for that, and this is why I think in a big way we're all here. I want to ask a question. Maybe this is a little bit more technical and logistic and these days political, but I'm with the International Law Institute. My name is Mark Walter. I live in the Asia Pacific, and the Pacific Island Forum has observer status with APEC. Out of 17 countries or economies, only 3 of those countries are members in APEC, leaving a giant black hole in the middle of APEC. Having played a role in developing Papua New Guinea's policy priorities for its host year in 2018, I feel like I can see, and I may be a bit biased in this regard, but I feel like I can see the development impact that it had on Papua New Guinea's policy development. I'm wondering, first of all, why we haven't heard much about APEC. I agree it's a different world than it was in 2018, and that may have a bigger impact on APEC than on other multilateral bodies. But I'm wondering if you see future opportunities through APEC, future leverage, and future programming on the USAID and DFAT side.
Okay, thank you. And one last question, Bart Edish.
Thank you, Romina. Bart Edish, I'm a senior associate here at CSIS, as well as a professor at the Institute for the Study of International Development at McGill University in Montreal. A couple of very quick questions for the minister if he has a moment to respond. The first one is, how is your country coping with the strengthened dollar? What kind of impact is that having on your work and the economy? And the second question is with the improved connectivity, so with the fiber optic cable, the one that exists and the one that's coming, is part of the diversification effort, economic diversification effort focused on exporting services. So, for example, empowering workers in Palau to provide services remotely to other countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bart. So the questions were, a tangible project, the APEC issue, and then the economics, the strengthening of the dollar and connectivity, if, a chance to export, services. So I will open the panel to whoever wants to tackle any of the three issues. Robert?
Well, maybe I'll start on the first one. I think the activity that we have, our Pacific America Fund, it would be something that might be along the lines of what you were talking about. Unfortunately, it's not in every community throughout the Pacific, but I think it could potentially be a model, and also another arm of the U.S. government. I can't speak on behalf of them, but is our Peace Corps, and with the pandemic easing restrictions on travel, the Peace Corps is looking to go back into countries within the Pacific, and having our Peace Corps volunteers out in the communities, and USAID has a support program. It's called Small Projects Assistance, SPA, where we do work with our Peace Corps volunteers to support community level projects like what you were talking about, but we do also do that through our Pacific America Fund. It's done again through a grant cycle where local organizations have an opportunity to submit proposals, and it is localized, and it's in line with our Administrator Samantha Power, her vision for us really focusing on localization of development and doing it differently and working through local institutions. So I would say that's kind of our effort to trying to address some of those localized needs at this point.
Thank you for bringing up the Peace Corps. I think Palau has benefited greatly from that program. Our current Minister of Education was a Peace Corps, married to a Palauan, so has contributed in many ways. So we look forward to having that program return back to Palau. I think it has, especially for our education system, a lot of benefit. And I think when it comes to community projects, I think they're also very good in identifying the needs, expressing the needs, and identifying the potential donor or partner to help make these things happen. Energy is quite critical for us. Like I said, I don't know if you picked up $6 a gallon. People, we here in the States complain about $4. Imagine what it's like at 6, and we almost hit 7. So energy is quite critical for us, especially when we have to service outer islands with fuel for their power plants and whatnot. To the questions that you raised to me, we are a dollar-based economy. So at this point, we are, peso in Manila when I was there was expected to go up to 68 in the exchange, and I've never seen that. I thought 58 was good, but 68 is an advantage to us. But when we're talking about getting tourists from Asia, it's not a good thing. So this will be a challenge for us in terms of tourism and having Palau be competitive in terms of cost for tourists to visit. We also have an issue because rates are increasing. A lot of our loans were based on the LIBOR rate. That kind of went away. Now we're doing SOFR, and all of those rates are increasing for our loans. So it's getting more expensive for us to borrow, and not a very attractive option to try to borrow our way out of a crisis. So dollar is strengthened dollar is a different impact on our economy. With the improved connectivity, Economic diversification is something we really look forward to. I was careful not to mention it earlier. I just mentioned the stablecoin, but we also this year issued digital residency. We're trying to take advantage of the metaverse and all the opportunities that are there. With our small market, we're more able to control the dynamics and the variables involved. At this point, we have already 1,800 digital residents. The idea is mainly to support them in the metaverse and in other trading platforms and cryptocurrency, but it's not to host our own currency. So this also gets back to the dollar. We use US dollar. US has told us that we can develop our own currency, but that would be crazy in terms of trying to do such a thing. So we look for other opportunities, but we do see digital nomads, US or Western companies domiciled in Palau or having corporate retreats or headquarters there or corporate meetings there, moving from Hong Kong as an example, could be an advantage. We're within 5 hours, maybe I'm selling a bit here, 5 hours from every major Asian city. President just signed an open sky agreement with Singapore, so improved connectivity there. But having a reason for people to be here in Palau and to make money like digital nomads, we see that as potential strategy that's made possible by this improved connectivity. So I think this is a big one for us, and we're also looking for assistance in trying to make that happen. IMF has agreed to help us with the stablecoin. We're looking at the Saudis, Koreans as potential other partners to take advantage of this opportunity and really make economic diversification something that could happen for us.
So I'm mindful of the time. You can, after the panel, you can talk to our panelists, and we have lunch right now. So why don't you join me in a round of applause to the panelists, and please continue the conversation. Lunch is in the second floor. Yes, upstairs. So